even though we might have more questions later.
We're going to just give it just a couple more minutes in case some other folks show up. I think we have 16 folks who've joined, so I think we can go ahead and get started. And just so everyone knows, Kira is recording this so that it can be viewed later if needed by you or your teams or folks who aren't able to join. Okay, so what we wanted to do in previous years, we've had this training kind of a subset that was covered during the CHO PPP meetings, the HMIS CHO PPP meetings. And so this year we wanted to open it up to a broader swath of folks as needed. As I mentioned before, this meeting is being recorded. And if anyone has questions, please feel free to raise your hand or interrupt me or put it in the chat. And I'm going to ask for my strategies team that's here to make sure that I notice any hands or chat questions as we go through the training. So the agenda for today is we're going to talk about the HIC and PIT process. It's been our goal for a couple of years now to have this training closer to the point in time that the HIC of the PIT count, because it is all about the counts on the night of the PIT. And so this year we're actually doing it closer, and you'll be getting workbooks hopefully out by the end of this week. We're going to go through the details of what the HIC PIT count is when it comes to HMIS and submitting it. The focus is on the HIC report and workbooks. We're going to go through the process. We're going to talk about the actual workbook, and then we're going to mention some tips. And as I've said, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to interrupt. So the HIC housing inventory count is a count of persons served and beds available on the night of the PIT count, which stands for point in time. And that was this year, the night of January 22nd to the 23rd. The HIC includes all residential projects dedicated to serving persons experiencing homelessness. That includes PSH, RRH, shelter, safe haven, transitional housing. The number of bed and units always refers to what was available on the night of the PIT count, regardless of what was contracted. So it's really about beds that are available or in use. If a client were to show up, any bed or unit that they could be placed in would be considered available, whether it was empty or being used. And beds under construction, renovation, or repair would not be considered available for use. And we do ask that your organizations report those to HMIS as they occur so that we can maintain an accurate inventory throughout the year. There is a report that the CHO PPP overview that is available in Clarity through system-wide through the data analysis tab. So at any point in time, you can check to see how many beds or units are available for use in your projects. Beds that are denoted on the contract that have not been established are not available for use. So this, we do not compare the beds in use on the night of the PIT count to your contracts for RRH and PSH. Bed unit counts are broken down by several variables, including household type, dedicated subpopulations, and other elements depending on the project type. It should also be noted that households with children are limited to households with children under age 18. Families comprised of adults will be reported as households without children. Additional data that's reported includes agency and project ID. This is assigned through the Clarity database, and so we will enter that data. You do not need to confirm it if you don't know it. You don't have to worry about it. Federal funding sources, which we would like you to confirm, agency and site primary addresses, zip codes where the most beds are located, HMIS participation status, VSP status, housing type, whether it's site-based or scattered site, etc. So we do want you to confirm all of that data when you get the workbook. Now, I wanted to show you what an inventory looks like when we enter it into Clarity. So every inventory has a start and end date. So as your inventory changes, we need to update the start and end date. For scattered site projects, we are able to use your actual enrollment and housing move-in date to determine the number of beds. So for scattered site projects, you don't have to let us know every time it changes. The COC where the beds are located, the housing type, whether it's without children, with children, or child only housing type. The reason that's important is that you may have more than one active inventory element for any given project, and usually that's defined by the number of households that you're serving and the type of households they are. So if you have a project that serves both singles and families, we would have 2 active inventories at any given point for those different project types. Dedicated subpopulation is also noted. So the dedicated subpopulation includes youth veterans, chronically homeless persons, chronically homeless veterans, chronically homeless youth, or non-dedicated. And those with asterisks are only collected for PSH projects. Inventory items, additional inventory items include the number of beds, and based on the HUD vernacular of a bed, every client spending the night must have a corresponding bed. That is how inventory is counted. So if you have beds that accommodate 2 people, those would be counted as 2 beds. If you have someone sleeping on a couch, that would be counted as a bed. So every client who is enrolled in a project must have a corresponding bed. Units are a count of the total number of units available for housing projects. That might be the house or apartment that is available where the beds are located. Shelters may not have a fixed number of units. In this case, a shelter can report distinct buildings or facilities as a unit, or distinct rooms used for congregate housing as units. Any of those would be appropriate. So there is a difference in how project inventory is collected based on project type. So starting with emergency shelter, for the person count, you would count any person who spends the night in the shelter on the night of the pit. If the person showed up for dinner and left before the next morning, they should not be counted. And then a bed is counted for any person who spends the night. As I said before, each client, based on HUD's definition of a bed, each client must have a distinct bed. Also, bed type is counted for emergency shelter. So whether the bed is facility-based, located in a designated shelter facility, voucher beds located in a hotel or motel and paid through vouchers, or other. These may be beds that are located in a church or place not dedicated for the intended use, but used for that purpose. Availability is also collected for shelter. That constitutes year-round beds, beds that are available throughout the year. Overflow beds are beds that may be available on an ad hoc or temporary basis, but that are not available throughout the year. So one example would be a crib. A crib is not available to everyone. They're available if there is a child who that crib would work for. A cot that can be added to a room would be considered overflow. It may not be used consistently, but it's available for use on an overflow basis. Or if someone was sleeping on a couch, that is not considered a standard bed, but it is, if someone was sleeping there, it could be used as overflow. And then seasonal are beds that are available during a defined high demand time, but are not available year round. And those start and end dates would then correspond with the time that beds were available. For scattered site tenant-based projects in PSH or RH, you would count any person who spends the night in the permanent unit on the night of the pit. That means that any person who has a housing move-in date on or before January 22nd and had not been exited would be counted as residing in the permanent housing unit. So each person whose head of household has a housing move-in date will be counted as long as that person is not exited. The bed count would include a separate bed for each person counted in the person count, which we've already gone over that. And the total number of persons should equal the total number of beds for scattered site, PSH, and RH projects. Because in tenant-based housing, it's available at the time of move-in. So the assumption is if there's a move-in date, the household or client is sleeping in the unit. And if there's an exit, they're leaving the unit. And that is why we have that process of if someone loses their housing, we exit them and re-enroll to rehouse. There may be some situations where a client spends a single night in shelter while having a housing move-in date. If someone is maybe stuck downtown and not able to get back to their unit location to spend the night, those situations will be handled on a case-by-case basis, including guidance from HUD as needed. So traditionally, we wait and submit the report and then find out what HUD requires us to do. And then the site addresses for scattered site projects will always equal the main agency address versus the address of all of the individual clients. For site-based PSH, we would count any person residing in the PSH unit on the night of the pit, who has a housing move-in date. So any person who has a housing move-in date into a site-based project would be counted as residing in the permanent housing unit. Persons whose head of household has a housing move-in date. A separate bed should be counted for each person, regardless of the actual physical beds. And the total number of units, both in use and not in use, should be counted. So if there is a site-based PSH project that has a unit that is available or in the process of being matched, that unit would be counted as available and not in use on that night. There may be some situations similar to scattered site where a client finds themselves staying in a shelter on the night of the HIC, the night of the pit, and those will be handled. Like I said, we'll get guidance from HUD and reach out to you to explain that situation. So for transitional housing and safe haven, you would count any person who spends the night in the TH or SH unit on the night of the pit. Clients should be exited from the program the day they leave. Therefore, anyone active in transitional housing or safe haven program on the night of the pit will be counted as being housed on that night. The total number of beds and units should be reported for the count based on what's available for use, whether it is in use or not, and bed and units being renovated or repaired or otherwise not available should not be counted, and the inventory should be updated in HMIS to reflect that change in availability. The VA designated components must also be reported for GPD projects. So that may be additional questions that we ask of you later for your GPD projects. So for SSVF-RRH, it's the same requirements as scattered site projects. Veterans receiving homeless prevention should not be counted, so only those that are housed through the RH project, except for one variation, which is SSVF emergency housing assistance, which generally will put a household in a hotel while they're waiting for the permanent unit. These, anyone housed through EHA on the night of the pit will need to be counted as in emergency shelter. This is handled through manually entering them. Megan, we have that report that we've used last year that shows us who has that service applied. We'll confirm that with you as well, just to make sure that the services are recorded correctly. HUD-VASH would count any person who has spent the night in the permanent housing unit, similar to scattered site PSH. One variable with HUD-VASH is that the VA does sometimes allow engagement with SSVFRH or GPD projects while they continue to be housed. This is not consistent with HUD guidance. As those issues come up, we'll work with the VA and potentially your GPD and SSVF projects as HUD requires. So another variable is that homes exports that are imported into Clarity only include data points collected for the veteran, not household members. So all of our VA housing is reported as single housing. This is consistent with HUD guidance, and HUD understands that variable. Rye and White, did I type that wrong? Youth dedicated housing projects, CISP-YDHP, right? Is that right? Sorry, I'm distracted. Anyway, for Ryan Keys, there is specific guidance for host homes. I don't think that we have any host homes being used currently. If we have anyone on the call who works with these projects and there were host homes engaged on the night of the pit, please contact us so that we can talk through how those need to be counted. Okay, then there are inventory types. There's current inventory beds and units that were available for occupancy, and then there are beds that are under development. I think in previous years, we've handled this a little differently. This year, we're adding beds under development to the workbook on the agency tab. You'll see that in a few minutes. And so we need to identify when the bed and unit inventory is expected to be available for occupancy within the following 12 months from the night of the count in order for it to be included in the HIC. If you have inventory that's under construction that will not be available within the following 12 months, that's fine. That is not an HMIS issue at all. We just would not include that on the HIC. So that's a variable to consider. And only inventory that has not yet been in operation should be listed as under development. So those units that might be under renovation or repair would not be counted as under development. They would just be not counted as currently available, either one. Okay, any questions so far? Okie doke. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our process, how we get through, how we do it. All projects can use the CHO HMIS overview report under the data analysis tab. This will give you an update on what inventory is available. And it does use housing move-in date for scattered site projects. So it should give you an accurate count. You can check that at any point in time. I believe we have started sending it out quarterly for confirmation, and that is so that we can maintain accurate inventory throughout the year. We do ongoing data quality monitoring throughout the year, as you guys all know, and you can continue to run those reports as well. Make sure appropriate dates are entered for enrollments, exit, and housing move-in dates. And then we will send you your HIC workbooks, which we'll review in more detail in the next section. So we want to make sure that those are correct by checking data quality. There are also data quality errors that are highlighted when we run the reports for the workbooks. We've been reaching out to you about those errors currently. And there are several reports available from the report library and data analysis tab that can assist you with monitoring your own data. And you can also contact HMIS support or refer to our knowledge base of articles to help you with that. So the timeline is that this year we're doing a little different. So we have a split timeline because we wanted to get the data confirmed closer to the night of the pit count. So we will be sending you your workbooks, hopefully by the end of the week, asking you to confirm those workbooks. You send them back to us and we track who is confirmed and that the data is accurate. We don't expect that the HIC will actually be open for uploads until April or May. So at that time, we'll review the system against the workbooks that have been approved. And if there's any inconsistency, we'll reach out to you at that time. So if the data doesn't change between now and then, we're just going to use the data. It's already been confirmed. So we're hoping that by running through the first part of this process closer to the night of the pit, that your gut checks will be more accurate because there's less time between the night of the pit and receiving the workbooks. There may be other issues that are flagged when we upload the report. Last year, HUD changed the process for the reporting. Prior to last year, we manually entered all the data, so we had a great deal of control over it. And we also, manual data entry is prone to error, so there's a positive and a negative there. Beginning with last year, it's an upload directly that gets processed. So there may be situations where if a client is in shelter and also housed, that we have to dig into that a little deeper and get HUD guidance on how to handle that, because we no longer can manually just modify the results. Yes, Megan.
This might be a topic for offline, but I know that we've added co-enrollment with HUD-VASH and SSVF as a feature and a field. So how is that going to play into, is it going to spark and generate errors on these uploads, or have we worked out how we're going to navigate that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the HIC is basically a one-day LSA. That's how HUD has designed that upload. And early on in the LSA, there were a lot of issues around how SSVF and overlap between SSVF and HUD-VASH and GPD and HUD-VASH. And in the LSA we did most recently, and after iterations of HUD improving the LSA process, that is no longer known as an issue because the VA accepts that, like it's an acceptable response. So that is my expectation for the HIC, but we'll know when we upload the report if any of that has changed. And if that has changed, we'll reach out to you to problem solve and figure out what the response is. And part of that can be to tell HUD this is not exactly accurate based on how VA operates, which is why it has been changed with the LSA. So at this point, I don't anticipate challenges, but we'll wait and see in that reporting timeline if anything comes up. So hopefully for most of you, we'll confirm all the workbooks, the work will be done, that'll be the end of that. For some of you, if the data has changed or if HUD is kind of pushing back on things that we expect, we may have to reach out and problem solve in regard to that. Okay, so much of this has already happened, that we've notified you of when the HIC and the pit count was. We are now working on the workbooks, and the workbooks will be mailed out to each agency with a deadline to return with corrections or approvals. Some of you already know that sometimes that can ensue some conversation. That's perfectly fine. We need to understand the circumstances around what's going on so that we can provide the best guidance. And as I said, if we may determine we think this is acceptable, and then later upload the report and have to navigate HUD, so HUD's guidance. So that's kind of where there are some variables that may change, but hopefully not. We do our due diligence to try to provide the best guidance that we can. Then in April, we will upload, we might do some additional data cleaning based on errant records that might occur through the API, make sure all of our imports are correct, and then we'll compare the data that was confirmed with the data that is available the night, when it comes time to upload the report. We'll navigate any changes, we'll upload the report, and then if we get errors or warnings that need to be addressed, we'll reach out again to try to confirm that data, or explain the specific situation. So if there are no questions on the process, I'm going to walk you through what the workbooks are going to look like. They're very similar to last year. We have made a couple of changes. Every agency will receive a workbook. We will highlight any number in red and also yellow that we need you to complete if we don't have that data available to us. Any data that we have available to us through the system, we will add to the workbooks for you to just simply confirm. If you have any changes, then you would highlight those changes. You can also add notes to the workbook. And then when we get the workbook back, we may ask some additional questions. So in that regard, it's gonna flow very similarly as to previous years. One difference is, since we're doing this training, we will not add an instructions tab this year. We will provide this PowerPoint with the workbooks, and you can also request a recording of the meeting if you have questions, or you can just reach out to us. It's not a problem. We're here to help. Another change is on the agency details tab. We've left open a place for projects under development so that you can add additional detail here. If we're aware of these projects, we'll add what information we have for you to confirm, and the rest of the information we would highlight in red if we needed you to complete that. Right now, if you have a couple of projects under development that maybe HMIS has not been aware of, you can simply highlight the rows 12 through 30 and copy them and paste them down farther in the workbook. You can do that repeatedly on that agency details tab until all the under development projects are represented. Or if you want, you can just give us a call and we can walk through it too. So this is just to make it kind of seamless and easy, but we're happy to jump on a call. The actual workbook themselves will show up just very similar as to last year with a few edits. We will have a tab for each project within your agency. Each tab will need to be reviewed. We will include information about the project on each tab. Information that is grayed out is not expected to be edited. So you can see here, organization and project ID is something that's assigned by Clarity. We would not expect you to edit that. Everything that is not grayed out, we would expect you to confirm or edit. We did add a key to the bottom this year so that you can understand what some of the abbreviations stand for. And we've added funding sources. So we've changed it a little bit. We've added a little more detail and added funding sources into the actual table instead of having that listed below. So a few minor changes, but basically consistent with last year. So beds and units are counted by household type and subpopulation, as we mentioned. So you'll see each table will include, you can see the year-round beds for households with children, households without children, households with only children. Then there's the seasonal beds and overflow beds, which will be available to correct or confirm for emergency shelter projects, but will be grayed out for housing projects. And then the total bed count versus the PIT count. So I think that pretty much speaks to itself and is similar to previous years as well. So we've done really good. nailing this out in 30 minutes unless you guys have questions. But I mean, we have been through this. It's changed very little since previous years. If there are questions when we dig into it, that's perfectly understandable. It's a very nuanced and confusing process sometimes. So if you at any point you have any questions, you can reach out to me or Laura. We'll work collaboratively on giving you answers, or you can submit it to HMIS support. So tips for successful HIC PIT: review and correct data frequently, notify HMIS support as soon as inventory records change, use the CHO HMIS over report to track inventory and other project information, confirm workbooks quickly on or before the deadline if possible, enter missing or corrected data so that it's highlighted, or you can just plug it into an email so that it's easy for us to see, and then ask questions as needed. And for projects whose inventory changes frequently, there is a Clarity inventory tool that we can make available to any projects that are interested. And if you can email HMIS support if you want to investigate managing your own inventory using that tool. So I want to thank you all for your time. This is one of those reporting projects that can be a bit harrowing for HMIS. We appreciate all the work and time investment that you put into it, and we hope you feel supported through the process. But with that said, does anyone have any questions, concerns, or recommendations on how we can improve the process? Yes, Megan?
I had a couple questions, but I was trying to hold back. So can you define again, I'm taking notes myself, but so it's clear. I think it was slide 23. If you can you go back to that real quick? And there's a cell for bed versus unit. So can you just provide again one more time the definition of a bed versus what a definition of a unit is, just so that
Yeah.
it's clear for everybody. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. So in HUD vernacular, everything is nuanced. So HUD expects that a individual bed will be associated with each client who is enrolled in a project. So really, when you see the term bed, you might think of pillow. So if there's a place to lay a head, that would be considered a unique bed. Even if that place stores 2 pillows, it's available to 2 heads, we would count that as 2 beds. I know that's really confusing, but basically every individual client who has a place to sleep, that client would have an associated bed. So they don't ask me these things. That's all I can say.
I think that another way to look at it, and hopefully this isn't confusing it more, if you're thinking, for those of you who are like used to like subaward language, it'd be persons. And then units are households. Like if you look at your subaward.
Yep.
Is that better?
That's true of housing projects for sure. So,
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. For residential projects like transitional housing or shelter, a unit would be defined differently. So for many of our shelter projects, a unit is defined as a single unit because there is one facility that houses all of those rooms. So that's the only difference for transitional housing, safe haven, and emergency shelter. The unit is a little more fuzzy. I'm perfectly comfortable entering one unit. However, if there were multiple facilities, we could enter that. Or if there were separate congregate rooms within a shelter and a shelter wanted to report those as individual units, we can. That is not the definition of unit for shelter, transitional housing, and safe haven is flexible, which and is not closely defined by HUD. So it's perfectly fine if there's one shelter facility that we call that a single unit. That's perfectly fine. But for housing projects, that's right. An apartment, a place that anytime a household is where the place the household is residing would be considered a single unit, and any place that an individual was laying their head would be considered a single bed.
So for your screenshot here, I guess maybe that's what's confusing me. I take the screenshot here as a shelter because you have 3 quadrants of seasonal, well, 2
Mhm.
with a total seasonal and year-round beds. So I would assume this screenshot is for a shelter. So wouldn't unit like they have 43 different facilities? Is that what it's portraying based on what you just said? Like for shelter and transitional, I heard you say like unit is defined by the facility. And so if I read that, then this is showing me that there's 43 different facilities
Well, it could
that
be
serve 183 individuals.
it could be that that a specific shelter would define specific units, like Bethany House may decide to report each household room, each congregate area as a specific unit. So that could be okay. But if it's for shelter, you're absolutely right. It could also be a single unit. So that's where I'm saying that
Okay.
HUD's definition of units for shelters is really flexible. I don't think they actually use that very much.
Right.
But
Okay.
for right, so but for housing projects, that unit is more closely defined. So Megan, for your HCHV project, you may say we have one unit for singles and one unit for families. So you may report back 2 units. You may see
Right.
that we list one unit and you decide it's all one facility. I'm fine with that. I don't want to mess with it.
Got it.
And yeah, so HUD leaves that kind of flexibility. But if you had 2 distinct buildings, then maybe we would put 2 units. I mean, for those site-based emergency shelter, especially the facility-based beds, it's really flexible. If we were using vouchers in hotels, we would definitely want to define each hotel as a unit, or possibly even each hotel suite as a unit, for example. So for emergency shelter, it's much more confusing because it is flexible. So what do you count? But yeah, so
Okay. That's helpful.
cool.
And then I just didn't know, do we have a projected timeline of, and I know it's all up in the air, but it sounded like workbooks possibly will go out the end of the week. Is there a projected turnaround time to return to strategies?
Since we're actually going to use, our goal was to get this data out to you closer to the night of the pit, right? So that kind of that night, and then who was in your facilities during those times were, was a closer memory than doing it in April. We're not actually going to use that data until April. So I think we can give a 1 week or a 2 week time frame. That's a little different this year. We have plenty of time on this end because we're not going to report until April. So if you guys wanted to recommend, 2 weeks is good. That's kind of my inclination, to give a 2 week turnaround time. But if you would prefer, if you're me, doing things quicker, having a closer timeline might be helpful, because I do it right away and it doesn't get moved down on my list to where I forget about it. So you guys can feel free to recommend a timeline that you would prefer. When we send it out with a timeline, you can also push back and suggest an alternate timeline for your specific projects. And we're also have a lot more time to provide assistance. So if you need us to come out and help you work through the workbooks or provide some additional support. So doing it earlier is giving us a lot more flexibility on, it's not, in previous years, it was always kind of urgent. Like, we need this back by next week, or we need this in 3 days or something, because we were pushing up against the report. This year, because we're doing it early, we have a lot more flexibility. Okay, any other questions? I do just want to thank you all again for your time. I really do appreciate it. I imagine that some of you, when we come up with the HIC or data cleaning and data issues around the LSA, that you kind of groan the way I do when it's time to report on these things. So I do want to let you know how much I appreciate it. I know we're all busy. Engaging on this process earlier this year does give us more flexibility. So please do give us any suggestions on how we can improve it, or if you need additional time or additional assistance, we've built that into this timeline as well, since we won't be reporting on until April. So please don't hesitate to provide feedback or let us know your needs. And we'll be getting those workbooks out to you by the end of the week. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Have a great
day.
Thank you.
Good job, Kim.
Thank you. I think we're being recorded.
Yeah, I'll see you later.
Bye.